Hey, I'm Geoff from Make Everything, and today we're going to be making this 7-inch stainless steel chef's knife with some mother of pearl inlay. Check it out. So the design of the knife that we're going to be making today is actually based off of a knife that I made about 7 years ago. I made this set of kitchen knives that I designed back in 2013, and I used to try to make chef's knives kind of as a source of income, but it's been a long time. So I like the 8-inch chef's knife that you just saw, but I want to make one a little bit smaller for my own use, and we're going to use a little bit better material. This is the template that I had made, and if you're going to make a knife, or really anything in the shop that you might want to make again, I always recommend making a template. This is Mylar or Duralar. Mylar is, it's kind of slick on one side and toothy on the other, and what's nice about it is it's semi-transparent. So usually what I'll do is I'll trace out my design, and then I'll actually use these little locations, and I'll run a punch right through them, and they'll dimple on the back, and it's a really great way to get repeatable templates that you can hold on to, and these don't tear. They're not like paper. If you crumple them, they usually go back to shape. They're very, very durable, and Mylar is cheap, so we're going to use this and redesign to make this knife just a little bit smaller, and then cut it out of some 154 cm. So I basically just took the template that I had showed you, traced it out onto the toothy side of the Mylar, and took the blade shape, scaled it down in a way that I felt was appropriate to make a little bit shorter of a knife that I thought would handle pretty well. I left the actual handle of the knife the same exact size, and the original knife that I had made back in 2013 had 6 pins. I thought that was a nice look, so I put that back in, and I drew in some lines for where the inlay is going to be. Now, this sketch, can carry forward. If I wanted to go ahead and take this design and cut it out on the water jet, I could take this sketch, scan it into the computer, or take a photo of it, and then turn it into some vectorized art that I could bring in through Fusion or SketchUp and cut it out on the water jet. But this time, just to kind of go back to my roots, I'm going to cut this out on the bandsaw. And this will also allow me an opportunity to change up the design if I want to. So I'm using the Portaband, and I use a 14 TPI blade just from the big box store. And this is 1/8 inch CPM 154 or 154 CM, and it is tough on your bandsaw blades. It definitely puts up a fight, and by the time I'm done cutting out this blank, this blade is pretty dull. I usually like to push these things to the limit. I like to really get as much mileage as I can out of my bandsaw blade. So sometimes when I'm going to cut something out of a stainless like this, I'll actually put on an older blade that's not as sharp, just to not ruin a brand new one. So I take little cuts in on some of those finger grooves and the contours, and then I go over to the 2x72 grinder, and I start out just with an 80 grit belt. It's a zirconium belt, to refine the profile a little bit. Now I'll switch over to a small wheel attachment on the same grinder, and this is nice. This has a really tight radius. This is my Brodbeck's Ironworks 2x72. I use this pretty much for every step of the process in this video, so you'll be seeing it a lot. And it's got a lot of great attachments like that, and the really tall platen. So one of the things that I do on my knives is I like to do all the actual bevel grinding after I heat treat them. Just gives me more consistent results. So I'm trying to refine the shape to get it exactly where I want, get any of the burrs or the hard edges off of it before I go ahead and drill the holes for the pins, and then eventually do the heat treating. So with the shape all done, I'll take my template back over again, and like I said before, this is translucent material, and what's nice is it'll hold your punch location. So I just used one of those automatic center punches that are spring loaded, and I punched right through the material, and it'll actually leave little dimples in the material, so it'll make it easy to punch holes if I wanted to use the same template again. I'm going to be using ebony for the scales, so I head over to the bandsaw after I trace out the profile of the knife, and I was pretty tight on my material here, so I had to trace these and cut these pretty close. But after I cut out one and I get it pretty close to the overall shape, I'll actually trace that one back onto the material to make sure that I have enough to cut out the second one and use as little material and provide as little scrap as possible. Now over on the drill press, I'm going to use an 1/8 inch drill bit to drill out the pinholes in the blade itself. Now eventually I'm going to be using 1/8 inch brass pins in this, so I will take the drill bit up one size from the 1/8 inch. I'll drill a 5/32 hole through the steel, but for right now I want an exactly 1/8 inch diameter hole in the blade so that I can go through and transfer that hole into the scales. So one at a time, I clamp the scales to the actual handle of the blade, and I use a couple of pins to make sure I don't lose my location. And what you'll find when you're drilling handle scales is a lot of times the material will blow out on the backside. So I always put the scales on the opposite side of the blade that I'm actually going to be using them on when I'm drilling the pinholes. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to drill through and not worry about any tear out that the drill bit might cause on the scale material, because the blown out side is going to wind up actually on the inside facing the metal of the handle. So hopefully that makes sense, but you'll see a little bit of it as I move a little bit further into this build. Now I'll just drive a couple of test pins in there and get an idea of what these scales look like. I can do a little more shaping and refining. And one of the things I like to do, I'm trying to maximize my time that I'm working in the shop to be as efficient as possible. So while the knife is being heat treated, I'll actually be working on the scales. So for me, I like to get my scales refined to the point where they're just about 1/16 of an inch bigger than the metal on the handle of the blade. So I'm going to attach these just temporarily using these pins, and I'm going to grind right up close to the profile of the metal, and I'm going to get these scales really, really tight to that profile. And what that's going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to work on the scales while the blade is in the heat treating oven for a couple of hours, and not have to waste that time and occupy it doing something else. One of the nice things about this grinder is I can put the platen on vertically like that and leave the grinder straight up and down. The grinder can also tilt on its side, but I prefer to use it vertically like this. And what this allows me to do is get a nice flat reference surface to profile in those scales. With everything around the edges of the blade looking really nice, I can just do a little bit more refining on the top side of the scales and clean them up, make them nice and smooth. I'll do another test fit of the scales, and I will trace out the top of the arc of the scale so that I can put in my maker's mark, which is just a simple letter Z that I put in with a hardened punch. And I also have to do that pre-heat treat, because once the blade is hardened, I wouldn't be able to punch it. Now again, this is CPM 154, and you need to wrap this in a stainless steel heat treating foil. And this is just a high temperature foil, and it keeps any air or impurities from getting to the metal. So what I'm going to do is make a little pouch out of it. If you've ever tried to heat treat stainless, you need a pouch like this. What's nice about it is that you don't get any scale on it. If you've ever heat treated in oil, there can be a lot of scale when you're done. The blade looks pretty crusty. You got to grind all that off. With the stainless heat treating, you don't get any of that. You just get a little bit of coloration. So I'm making this packet. I'm folding over the edges using a little sheet metal tool. And I like to make a pouch, drop my blade into it, and then I can go ahead and seal up the end. I just use a little hammer to hammer over those creases after I fold them over 2 times, because I want to make sure that the pouch is airtight. Now I'm using an Evenheat kiln to heat treat this. This is my first time using this kiln, and it has the tap controller. This thing is unbelievable. You can program an unlimited amount of ramps and a really complicated heat treating schedule into your knives with so little effort, and it's absolutely going to make my process way more precise. I'm really excited to have it. So now working back on the scales, like I said, trying to be efficient. Now the knife is in the oven for about a hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to make up a little jig so that I can do the mother of pearl inlay. Now this is just a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, and I'm just going to lay out a couple of marks here. And since the scales are identical, I can lay out these marks on opposite sides of the line, basically in parallel, and then I can drill pins and I can locate these scales on either side of that line. And when I use the milling machine to mill in the slots, it'll just give me a perfect cut, perfect inlay. So it's a little bit, it's a little bit out of people's range to have a milling machine to do this type of operation. You could do this with a router, but I just like to kind of use all the tools in my shop and try to learn how I can use tools in different ways. So most people don't mill wood with their milling machine, but it works great. So I throw this in the vise on some parallels, and I'm just using a little 1/4 inch carbide end mill that I have, and I'm going to be milling in this slot. Before I do anything, I throw some clamps on the scales just to make sure they don't move. Obviously, this machine is set up to mill metal, especially with a carbide end mill. This thing will cut through steel pretty easily, but it makes quick work of the ebony, makes a really clean cut, and it's just so consistent. It's so much more consistent than using a chisel or any other way to do an inlay in scales like this. It also allowed me to make the inlay pretty deep, which I thought would be nice because then you would see the mother of pearl on both sides. Now for the actual mother of pearl, I'm going to be using what's called Easy-Inlay. It's made by my friend Scott Grove, and it's a flake material that you can put in with CA glue or epoxy to do an easy mother of pearl inlay in this exact application. So the first time I tried to do this, I put in a bunch of mother of pearl, and then I tried to fill it in with very thin glue. And this just didn't work very well at all. The mother of pearl was too thick and too dense, so I wound up going through an hour or two trying to get this to work, and then scrapping it and redoing the grinding on the milling machine and trying again. All right, let's try this again. All right, let's try this again. So I made the inlay just a little bit bigger, started from scratch, used my same little template board, my little fixture board again, and I'm using HVAC tape to act as a barrier for the super glue. All right, we're going to do this smarter this time. We're going to do this smarter this time. We're going to put down a base of material. A little bit at a time. And we're going to go a little bit at a time. So I put in the Easy-Inlay just a little bit at a time in little layers. Throw in some glue, a little bit of activator. This is the Starbond glue, and I'll throw a link to this down in the description. A little bit of glue, a little bit of mother of pearl, and just built it up. And this turned out to be a way better way of doing it. It was way more stable, and eventually I wound up just kind of putting a coat of glue over the top of it, and I gave it a lot of time to dry, and it's set up really nice. The problem I was having with the first way I did it was so porous that every time I would grind it, the ebony would streak into it, and since there was still unset glue in there, the ebony would immediately hit the super glue, and then I would have these black streaks in there, and it really it just didn't look clean. It looked kind of muddy and dirty. So by taking my time and doing it a little more carefully, I was able to get a much better end result. Now during that time, the knife was in the oven. I'm able to pull it out and throw it in between my two 3/4 inch aluminum quench plates. Now this is as opposed to using like an oil quench. And this allows the blade to cool really quickly, and the plates keep it from warping. That's another reason why I choose to grind my bevels after I heat treat, because it really helps you avoid any warping. Now I threw it on my Rockwell tester to see how hard the blade was before I go to temper it. I get about 61, a little higher than 61 Rockwell, which is great. I'm not going to do any cryo treatment on this just because I don't have the setup, and I'll go ahead and temper it at 425 degrees for 2 hours for 2 cycles. In the end, I wound up with a 59 Rockwell blade. So I pull those pins out after I gave that glue some nice time to dry. Some of it got down onto the board, so I had to use a knife to get it up. But overall, the mother of pearl wound up stabilizing really well and sat really nicely inside the ebony scales. I used a little pin to pull out any imperfections, pop any bubbles, and fill it in with glue. Any little touch-ups that I had to do, I was able to just do with a medium clear CA glue, a little bit at a time on the edges, and then I can kind of flatten out the back, throw these on the knife, get an idea of what it's going to look like, and continue onward. I decided to use the milling machine again just to flatten off the top of the inlay. It was just better than grinding it. Like I said, when I was grinding this on the sander, for some reason it was smearing the ebony into the inlay section, and with the white you really noticed every little speck of the black wood in there. So I used just the same end mill and just kind of faced off the top of these, and this will just give me a nice clean cut without any abrasive running through it, or also without generating any heat. You have to be careful anytime you grind an inlay in epoxy or super glue, because the sandpaper creates a lot of heat and it can melt it or it can ruin the set on the glue. So now it's time to start grinding the blade. I'm just using some red Dykem and marking up the edge, and then I'll go over to a granite surface block using a little height gauge with a scribe tip on it, and I'll scribe the center of the blade. Now normally I'll scribe 2 lines and they'll leave me with a little material in the middle, but I decided to take this grind close to 0. I want this thing to be really, really sharp, and since it's an 1/8 inch blade, which is normally twice as thick as what I would make a kitchen knife out of, I know I have a lot of grinding to do, so I really want to make sure that I do nice, long, consistent bevels and I get all the way down to that edge. I have a little grinding bevel guard that I just made out of 2 pieces of 1/4 inch steel, and I'm going to bolt that over to the blade just to make sure that my grind doesn't hit the touch mark that I put in before heat treat. Now the grinding process I'm doing on this is all going to be freehand. I'm starting out with a 36 grit belt from Faird, and this thing just eats through the material. And what's nice about some of these belts, you know, like this is a structured abrasive belt, so you're getting a lot less fine grinding dust, and you're almost getting like grinding chips. You get these long strands of metal coming off the belt, and it really goes through the metal efficiently. The blade stays nice and cool. I'm conscious to dunk it in water very often, because remember, this thing is heat treated and tempered, so I don't want to ruin that temper. The last thing I want to do is see any coloration on the blade, because that'll tell me that I ruined the temper that I just, you know, spent 4 hours on. So I take my time grinding this in, basically go across one surface, dunk it in some water, and I'm constantly checking the bevel to make sure that I'm staying nice and flat. And using that little grinding guard, I'm able to not have to worry about the ricasso where the bevel stops, and I can grind right up to it using this nice big platen. Once I'm done with the 36 grit belt, I used to move to a 120. And this just helps me further refine the bevels. At this point, my edge is probably pretty fat. It's probably about 64th, maybe even a 32nd, and I want to bring it down. So as I go up through the grits, I'll get that edge closer and closer to the center line. I'll move up to a 220 belt and continue to just go up the way. And now I'm just sort of trying to refine those lines, make sure there aren't any heavy grind lines in there. Now I wound up taking this all the way up to a 600 grit finish, and it was nice. It was a very bright finish, but it showed too many imperfections. You know, like my grind wasn't perfect, and it was really bothering me. So at the advice of my friend Steve Pellegrino, I went back to a red Scotch-Brite style abrasive belt, and what that did is it just blended out all those imperfections and gave me a beautiful workable finish. This really nice kind of brushed finish, all the lines going in the same direction, and I was really happy with the way that it looked when it was done. Now the thing about the Scotch-Brite is sometimes I'll grind it edge down just because the Scotch-Brite is really, really coarse, and sometimes it'll just kind of pop off in your face. But you can see that really nice brushed finish, really uniform, and it looks really professional. Now, something I should have done before I ground in those bevels was I should have done some work to the flat part of the knife, really at the top of where the scales will be. I should have ground that in before I ground in the bevels, because it was pretty difficult to get back in there and clean that up now. I had to take blue tape and cover the blade completely so I wouldn't mess up a nice grind. I was very proud of this grind because, honestly, I'm not great at grinding blades freehand. Normally I use a jig when I make smaller folding knives, so to do this big blade freehand was really cool. Since it's made from 1/8 inch stock, I wanted to take some weight off of the handle. You saw me kind of try to balance it before. So something I've seen other guys do, and I've never actually tried myself, was to kind of scallop some material out of the handle. So I set up my grinder on this extreme angle, and then I just basically took out material inside the handle as best as I could. Now, I could have drilled some holes pre-heat treat, but I didn't do that, so now I had to deal with a hardened blade. And this worked out really good. I used a 36 grit belt, and that steel wheel was a nice tight radius, and you can see that nice scallop I got in there. And it really, it helped. It helped a lot with the weight and the balance. You can see here I'm trying to take care of that flat spot on the top of the scales. Like I said, I definitely should have done this before I ground in the bevel. I was super nervous, but it worked out really nice. What's cool is I'm able to move the platen in and out, which helps me get a little bit tighter into some of those hard to reach areas. Now, before I can glue my scales on, I have to do all the finishing work to the tops of them because I won't be able to get to that area once everything's glued up. So I bring these up through the grits, and I'm going with just sort of a gentle curve on top. I like a pretty geometric handle on my knives. I don't try to make anything too round, and I don't really put too much swoops or swells in the knife scales. So bringing the ebony all the way up, making everything nice and smooth, and then I'll protect this and make sure that it stays clear of any epoxy when I do the actual glue up of the scales. This is a really important step. If you forget to do this, it can really be a pain to try to get back in there and clean these up once the epoxy's set and you're right up against your blade. I'm using 1/8 inch solid brass pins to keep the scales on. I like to give a little tooth to the pins and round off the edges so you don't blow up your scale material when you hammer them through. I'm using a G5 epoxy. This stuff works pretty well, and I was, not to say I was rushing, but I wanted this project to progress, so I wanted to use a quick setting epoxy, and this stuff is really strong. So I throw a couple of drops of black dye in there, and that just makes sure that if any of the epoxy does use out or I miss anything, it's not going to be noticed. It'll also fill any potential gaps, and it'll fill it in a way that it's not going to be noticeable. I throw a little bit on there and just tap everything together with this little hammer. Now I'm looking for squeeze out up on the top section. Obviously I want to make sure that the epoxy is really in every nook and cranny on this scales. So as I throw my clamps in, I'm just careful to watch for any squeeze out on the top, and I clean it up with a Q-tip with a little bit of acetone on it. I let the epoxy set up and get nice and hard before I start doing any more work on it. Now's the time to clean up though, because if you don't do it now, it's a lot harder to get that epoxy off once it's dry. So the first thing I go to on the grinder is this top finger hole. I throw that small wheel attachment back on, and I start to grind out any of the epoxy and any of the ebony that's sticking over and get down to the bare metal. I also put a nice heavy chamfer on these because this is where your index finger is going to rest. So I throw a pretty heavy chamfer in, and I bring that up through the grits, and this allows me to kind of move on from this small wheel attachment and just use the grinder with the platen really to finish up the whole rest of the knife. switch to a little bit larger of a wheel to do the second set of finger area, and I grind that out, make sure everything gets back down to bare metal. I'm mindful of the area where the mother of pearl is. I don't want to get it too hot. I don't want to melt any of that glue, and I want to just make sure that everything is nice and clean and smooth. Now once that's done on the small wheel, I can go over to the nice big flatten, and I can start running up and down this spine of this blade, just cleaning everything up, making sure everything is really smooth and easy to handle. I like grinding my scales vertically like this and the spine vertically like this. It really runs with the grain of the wood, and really leaves a nice finish. You can contour things, and I usually do contour up against the flatten as opposed to using the slack belt. Every once in a while I go over and I grab the air compressor and blow out any ebony that might be inside the mother of pearl inlay, and then I can fill it in with any little drabs of super glue if I have to. I'm very careful to grind my pins off, because what I learned while I was doing my experiments with this was that if I try to grind this mother of pearl with the belt grinder, I'm going to mess it up. So I'm very carefully grinding the tips of the pins off, and then in order to actually finish the scales, I'm going to go over to my granite block, and I'm going to use some wet dry silicon carbide sandpaper and just kind of hand sand the faces of these scales. Like I said, I'm going for a kind of geometric handle, so I bring this up from 220 all the way to 800, just moving back and forth on the flat granite plate, making sure that I'm getting nice good toothy material on the sandpaper and getting everything really smooth and flat. And it buffs up the ebony and the mother of pearl really well just using the sandpaper itself. And for all of you that are offended that I'm sanding on my granite block, that's exactly what this granite block is for. I've got another one in my machine shop that doesn't see any sandpaper or any grit. This thing is basically for scribing in knives and sanding on a flat plate. I can reveal my edge again and my blade and really see how this thing is going to turn out when it's all done. I like to do my cleanup with acetone and a Q-tip, just make sure there's nothing on there, any glue that might have gotten anywhere, get all that off it. Now for my handle finish, I'm going to be using some clear mineral oil, and I'm going to soak the handle in there for a little while, and it just gets into all the nooks and crannies, really fills it and pretty much stabilizes the material. White mineral oil is completely food safe. It will never spoil. It's what I use on cutting boards. It's a really good finish. It's very easily serviceable. Once it's had some time to soak in, I'll wipe off the excess, take a little bit of sandpaper, clean up any burrs that might be over on the edge, and I'll use some Renaissance wax to add another layer of protection to the scales and pretty much to the whole back side of the knife. Now for the sharpening process on this, I'm going to do a little bit of a process that my friend Geoff told me. He's got the same Brodbeck grinder as I do, and he recommended going and using the kind of the multi-wheel platen and grinding in on the slack belt. So a lot of guys grind in on a large slack belt. You kind of want like a bit of an apple seed style edge, but with the two tight wheels on this grinder, I'm able to give a really tight slack, and that just gives me a sharper edge. Now this knife is going to my home kitchen, and I don't sharpen with stones at home, so I didn't really want to try to do a stone finish on this. So I start over at 220 and I freehand grind in my secondary bevel, and I'm trying to raise a burr, look for that nice, very fine white burr that as it comes over the side, you can just see it as you flip side. So I go from 220 to 400 to 800 grit on this tiny little slack wheel, and this gives me already a sharp edge. But just to hone it in a little bit better, I go over to the 1x30 and I use a leather belt with some green buffing compound, and this thing is razor sharp. This might be the sharpest knife I've ever made. It literally falls through material, and I'm like scared to use it because I know once it bites me, I'm gonna be hurting. And I had to have a little fun with the paper tube. all in all, I'm really happy with how this thing came out. It was a great re-entry into knife making, and I can't wait to make more. Feels really good in my hand. Really happy with the 7-inch blade versus the 8-inch blade, and the fact that it's in a very reliable stainless. I know it's going to last a really long time. All right, that about does it for this project. I really enjoyed making this. So, like you saw in the beginning of the video, this is based off of a design for some chef's knives that I made 6 or 7 years ago. So it's been a long time. Back when I was making those knives, I was in my garage shop. I didn't nearly have the tooling that I have now. And let me tell you, this was way more enjoyable than making knives of this size on like a little belt grinder with the wrong heat treating oven and all these different things. So anyway, I hope to make more of these, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And if you want to follow me along day to day, I posted kind of a build along process as I was making this on my Instagram. You can follow that here at Make Everything Shop. I post pretty much every day and share a lot of behind the scenes stuff, especially when I'm working on multi-day projects like this. If you want to see more knife making videos, don't forget to leave a comment for that as well. I made a bunch of these a couple of years back, but it's been a while. But again, I really enjoyed this, and I would love to make some more knives and some more videos about them, hopefully share a little bit of information. Thank you to Geoff Fader and Steve Pellegrino, two excellent knife makers that you have to check out that helped me along the way. I had some questions, and those guys came in and answered them for me and gave me a bunch of information. And yeah, they make incredible work. They are real knife makers, and you should absolutely follow them and check them out. Again, I'm Geoff from Make Everything. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks.